Hi, my name is Miguel Sebastian, and before starting let me thank Richard Brown for his great job organizing this conference. In this video I'm gonna try to sketch the main ideas of my paper, What Panpsychists Should Reject, on the incompatibility of Panpsychism and organizational invariantism. If you are interested in these ideas, I invite you to read the paper. On the one hand, materialists who find conceivability arguments compelling and those with dualist inclinations who, believing in the causal clusters of the physics, do not want to render consciousness epiphenomenal, might find in panpsychism an interesting route to explore. On the other, there are good reasons for believing that organizational invariantism is true. Some philosophers, like David Chalmers, have either shown their sympathy for both principles or explicitly endorsed them. The purpose of this paper is to show the tension between the arguments that back up both principles, and I am going to argue that such a tension should lead defenders of one of the principles to give up on the other. Let me start with the first thesis, namely panpsychism. Panpsychism explodes the idea that physics only tells us about structures and functions. It remains neutral about the intrinsic nature of the fundamental entities of our world, be them quarks, strings, or whatever physics ultimately tells us. These fundamental entities give rise to macroscopic entities like chairs, tables, humans, etc. So panpsychism can be characterized as the doctrine that the mind is a fundamental feature of the world which exists throughout the universe. So the most fundamental entities enjoy mentality. In this paper I am interested in consciousness. If one believes that there is an important distinction between conscious and unconscious mental states, and leaving aside other mental properties, then one should endorse a less radical form of panpsychism, usually known as panprotopsychism. Panprotopsychism can be roughly presented as the claim that the microphysical fundamental entities of the world, once properly related to each other, give rise to all sorts of physical entities, and due to its intrinsic nature, also to consciousness. So when I talk of panpsychism, I will have this latter form of panpsychism in mind. The objections will apply mutatis mutandi, or so I think, to other forms of panpsychism. Motivation for panpsychism might be found in anti-materialist arguments. In their general form, these arguments are supported by the claim that structure and function don't suffice for explaining consciousness, what together with the claim that physical accounts explain at most structure and function entails the conclusion that physical accounts cannot explain consciousness. From this explanatory gap, some philosophers derive an ontological gap. Consciousness is not physical, materialism is false. One of the most celebrated arguments is the conceivability argument. It holds that we can conceive that there is a possible world, call it a zombie world, which is a microphysical duplicate of the actual world, but such that some phenomenal truth in our world is not true in zombie world, and that therefore the zombie world is possible. But if it is possible, then materialism is false, insofar as we take materialism to be committed to the claim that everything that is true in the actual world is true in a minimal duplicate of it, namely a world which satisfies all the physical truth in our world, and that's all. Granting the conceivability of a zombie world, the entailment from conceivability to possibility involved in the argument has been rejected by many authors. To avoid them, Chalmers presents an analysis of conceivability that attempts to avoid clear counterexamples and single out the circumstances in which conceivability is a good guide to metaphysical possibility. If you are not familiar with them, you can read some of the details that I am skipping in this presentation in the paper, where you will also find the reference. Conceivability, once properly refined, seems to entail at least epistemic possibility. In informal terms, we can think of epistemic possibility as a possibility for a competent though sufficiently ignorant speaker. This is the sense in which, for all a 15th century inhabitant knew, water might not be H2O. In this case, we say that there is a world that verifies that water is not H2O. Epistemic possibility is not metaphysical possibility, and it is the latter what is required to defeat materialism. There is no metaphysically possible world in which water is not H2O. We say, following Chalmers' parlance, that whereas there is a world that verifies that water is not H2O, there is no world that satisfies that water is not H2O. With these tools in hand, we can sketch Chalmers' argument. So let P be the conjunction of all the microphysical truth of the universe, and Q a phenomenal truth like there is pain. We have premise 1 that says that P and not Q is conceivable in the right way, and we have seen that once conceivability is properly refined, if P and not Q is conceivable in that way, then P and not Q is epistemically possible, namely there is a world that verifies P and not Q. 3 says that if P and not Q is epistemically possible, then P and not Q is metaphysically possible. That is to say, materialism is false or panpsychism is true. Either there is a world that satisfies P and not Q, or no world that satisfies P also satisfies not Q. Support for this claim might be found in Kripke. If he's right, then there is no distinction between appearances and reality in the case of consciousness, and then the entailment from epistemic possibility to metaphysical possibility seems warranted in the case of phenomenal truth. So every world that verifies a phenomenal truth is a world that satisfies it. One way to reject the metaphysical possibility of P and not Q is to hold that the intrinsic nature of fundamental entities is tied to consciousness. That is to say, panpsychism is true. In this case, there are worlds that verify P and also verify not Q, namely those worlds sufficiently close to ours, in which the fundamental microphysical entities have different intrinsic nature from ours, one that is not tied to consciousness, while no world that satisfies P also satisfies not Q. If one believes in the causal closure of physics that do not want to render consciousness epiphenomenal, then panpsychism is definitely the way to go. Let me now motivate the other main character in this story, the principle of organizational invariantism. This principle holds that two systems with a sufficiently fine-grained functional organization, one to fix the mechanism responsible for the production of behavior and to fix behavioral dispositions, will entertain experiences that are qualitatively identical. According to OI, what matters for phenomenal character of experience is a certain, sufficiently fine-grained, functional organization, and that once this functional organization is satisfied, we can abstract from its particular realization. So suppose that the required sufficiently fine-grained functional organization is that of neural network. Biological neurons in our brain have a certain biochemical composition, but if OI is true, then, at least in the actual world, such a composition is irrelevant for our experiences. In this case, what is required for being a neuron is that they satisfy a certain description like the one here. Biological neurons obviously satisfy it, but also electronic circuit like the one here would allow us to build up artificial neurons in a silicon chip. It would be possible to replace our neurons by those silicon chips without a change in the required functional organization, and therefore, according to OI, without a change in experiences. Although this principle has not gone without controversy, Chalmers provides two convincing arguments in its favor, the fading qualia and the dancing qualia argument. Let me present just one of them, and you can find the other in the paper and also the reference to Chalmers' original work. In the dancing qualia argument, we consider someone looking, for example, at a red apple and having an experience of a red apple. If we identify the core neural correlate of this experience, then we would be able to create a functionally equivalent circuit but made out of silicon chips instead of biological neurons. Suppose now that in this subject we install this circuit as a backup and connect a switch to be able to change from the biological to the silicon circuit. If organizational invariantism were false, then as we flip the switch from one position to the other, the subject's experience would change. Imagine that when the switch connects the silicon circuit to the rest of the brain, the subject's experience changes to one as of a green apple. The change in the leaf position is only due to my inability to find a better picture. What is important is that such a change in experience would go unnoticed for the subject. What is more, we can imagine flipping the switch back and forth so that the experiences dance before the subject's eyes. But he still won't be able to notice any change. And the argument rests precisely in the implausibility of this example. In what follows, I am going to argue that panpsychism and organizational invariantism are not compatible principles. If one thinks that dancing and fading qualia arguments support the truth of organizational invariantism in the actual world, then one should, Chalmers, give up panpsychism. On the one hand, organizational invariantism maintains that what matters for consciousness is to satisfy a certain functional organization. We can abstract from the particular realization of such a functional organization. On the other, panpsychism maintains that consciousness constitutively depends on the intrinsic features of our fundamental particles. There seems to be a tension between these two principles. I will explore this tension to show that the premises of the argument that back them up are incompatible. Following with the example above, let's assume that the sufficiently fine-grained functional organization is that of neural networks. In this case, conscious states can be made out of biological neurons and silicon chips. Imagine that the subject S is again looking at a red apple and that we decide to replace her biological neurons by a silicon chip. If we call the phenomenal character of her experience before the replacement Q1, we can consider the following three possibilities regarding the subject's experience after the replacement. First, we can consider the case that S has no experience. If that were the case, then organizational invariantism would be false. The second possibility is that the subject has another experience, another kind of experience, call it Q2. Well, if this is the case, then OI seems to be false, for there is a change in qualitative character without a change in the required functional structure. We can nonetheless accept 2 while keeping in the spirit of organizational invariantism by endorsing the following modified version of the principle. One that says that two systems with the same fine-grained functional organization will have the same phenomenal structure. According to this principle, Q2 relates to other experiences in the very same way as Q1 does. We can say that Q1 and Q2 are supersimilar experiences, where two experiences of different kind are supersimilar if and only if there is no experiential way to tell the two experiences apart. I think that postulating supersimilar experiences is problematic, to say the least. If Q1 and Q2 cannot be phenomenologically distinguished and they do not elicit different behavioral dispositions, it is unclear in what sense they be said to be different kind of experience. Commitment to supersimilar experiences is not the worst problems for those willing to take this route, as we are about to see. But let's have a look first to option 3. If 3 is true, then it seems that panpsychism is false. The reason is that all that it takes to be a neuron is to satisfy a certain pattern of causal interaction. Hence, it seems reasonable to assume that neurons can be as different in their fundamental properties as we wish. So let's assume, for the sake of the simplicity, that there is a unique kind of fundamental entity in the actual world, and let's call it string. According to panpsychism, consciousness depends on the intrinsic features of strings. But neurons might be made of different materials and have different internal structure, thereby differing the amount of strings and the relation among them required to realize different kind of neurons. If neurons can be so different at the microphysical level, then it seems that microphysical properties play no role in determining the experience. One possible reply would be to maintain that the intrinsic features of the fundamental particles of the actual world provide merely enabling conditions for the experience. Functional roles within a system determine the kind of experience, or sets of supersimilar experience if we go with two. And the particular kind of experience is determined by the structure of the neuron. Along these lines, a phenomenally conscious state is one that satisfies a certain functional role and is made out of the kind of entities that are fundamental in the actual world, namely strings. So, in our example, structure A would satisfy function F in the system S, plus strings realizing this structure A give rise to experience Q1, whereas structure B and strings realizing the structure B give rise to experience Q2. And in this case, Q1 and Q2 are either the same kind of experience, if we go with 3, or supersimilar experiences, if we go with 2. These alternatives seem to make panpsychism and organizational invariantism, or the varied version of organizational invariantism, compatible, but at the price of accepting that fundamental entities do not play any role in determining the kind of experience. So, in a final step, I will argue that even if one buys this ballet, the intuitions that back up panpsychism and organizational invariantism are nonetheless incompatible, and hence that one should give up on one of them. Let's continue with the assumption that strings are the fundamental entities of the actual world. Tables, red apples, butterflies, all of them supervene on properly organized strings, and according to panpsychism, so does conscious experience. Those who find in the concealability argument the motivation for panpsychism accept that there are worlds that verify P, where P is the conjunction of all the microphysical truth of the universe, but do not satisfy it because their fundamental entities differ in their intrinsic properties. Imagine one of these possible worlds in which their fundamental entities, we can call them string minus, differ in their intrinsic nature from strings. Furthermore, strings minus are such that they do not give rise to conscious experiences. So this world is a zombie world. It is a world that verifies P, but being made out of strings minus instead of strings does not satisfy P. And therefore it is a world that does not satisfy P and not Q. Worlds like this zombie world are not problematic, but we can now consider a semi-zombie world. A semi-zombie world is also a world that verifies P, but has both strings and strings minus as its fundamental entities, and therefore does not satisfy it. In this zombie world, tables, butterflies, and chocolate can be made out of strings minus, or a combination of both kind of entities. The problem is that this semi-zombie world allows us to mirror the argument in favor of organizational invariantism against panpsychism. So, how does it go? Imagine Martha, who is an inhabitant of this semi-zombie world. Her brain is completely made out of strings and she enjoys conscious experiences. Imagine that she is having a terrible headache at time t, and let this thing here be the core neural correlate of her painful experience. Let this thing here be a physical duplicate of it, but made out of strings minus. A commutator that allows us to connect either one or the other to the rest of the brain, as in dancing qualia thought experiment, is installed in Marta's brain, and she is asked to concentrate in her pain experience. When the string neuron circuit is connected, she has a horrible headache, whereas ex hypothesis, when string minus neuron circuit is connected, she has no pain experience at all. However, she cannot notice any difference. The position of the switch makes no difference at all to her. The implausibility of these cases is precisely what supports organizational invariantism in the original argument. Now, recall that the semi-zombie world verifies P, and that there is no way for us to know whether we in fact inhabit a world like this semi-zombie world. So, if one is persuaded that organizational invariantism is true of the actual world, then for the very same reason, one should reject the claim that Marta's experience changes as we flip the switch, thereby rejecting panpsychism. Well, in this paper I attempt to show that the reasons that lead one to endorse panpsychism as a solution to the concealability argument and to believe that the principle of organizational invariantism is true of the actual world are Pathet-Chalmers not consistent. It might still be the case that panpsychism is true and that organizational invariantism is true of the actual world, but we are left with no reason to believe such a thing, and there are good reasons to deny it. If one finds the dancing qualia and fading qualia arguments compelling, one should reject panpsychism, and if one believes that panpsychism is true, one should find a way to resist the dancing and fading qualia arguments. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you during the discussion in the 5th Consciousness Online. Bye!